Hey guys, it's Camilla from Code with Camilla. Today we're going to continue learning about functions.
Yes, today we will be talking about variable and function visibility. Uh, it's also called scope, so variable scope or function scope. The reason we need this concept is because uh, people are not very creative, right? And so you can keep calling variables probably same names, and like you don't want to always create a new, like invent a new variable every time when you write a program, or inside the program you don't want to spend hundreds of hours creating variable names, right?
But what does it mean for a function to be visible?
Now let me explain. Let's just get to that one. So since you don't want to, you want to use the apple for apple variable, right? Apple name for apple variable. But if you're using different functions, different modules, everything, if you keep calling the apple and it's only like if this apple used everywhere, it means that if you write somewhere the code and then use your brother's code which also use apple, and if they don't like they don't have their own scope means like only one small place where they are visible and they can be changed and they can be read. If you don't have this small like an environment or like a circle where they operate, in that case they will collide and will be lots of different things. For instance, if you're using your brother's function which uses apple as a variable and you create apple variable and you try to do something, then you call your brother's function and he does something, now you don't know what's in your apple variable because he may do something different, right?
So basically, a scope is kind of like a little shell or bubble within a function that protects some sort of code
Yeah,
or
so
contains.
imagine so your name is Camilla. There is another Camilla in different class or in different school, but we can always locate you by your class, so you're not colliding with the, like if you say Camilla, we don't and we say Camilla in this school, we mean you, and you cannot be confused with Camilla in some other school, right?
Oh, so it's labeling which code it belongs to?
So scope in this case will be your school, right? So Camilla in this school and Camilla in another school, they are different people, right?
So are the scopes given different names?
Let's get to that point. So there are three main rules in C sharp about visibility of the variable. Let's start with the variables. The first one, you cannot have the same variable uh, with the same name in the scope. Scope defines by these curly braces. So everything in these curly braces, right? You call this is the scope of your variable. So if I create here variable apple 0, right? I cannot create another variable with the same name. For instance, if I do a string apple, C# will not let me do it. If I try to build, it says function is already defined in this scope. It means inside these curly braces. So this is rule number one. You cannot use the same variable within the scope.
So basically, let's say you have int apple, but you can use string apple in a different scope.
You are correct. In a different scope, we can reuse the same variable. For instance, if we create scope, and we create scope by using these curly braces, right? Here, and this is another scope. And we can even change to 1. And let's see the build. it does build those variables, those warnings. Is because we're not using them. But you see, Apple inside this scope and Apple inside this scope, they are different variables, and they don't collide with each other. So it's
they're
like,
like aligning scopes. They're next to each other, but they're not part of each other.
yeah. So it's like Camilla in one scope is different from Camilla in different scope, and
I have a question. You know how you exactly copied this except for one? Let's say you like put some spaces and everything. Does it like screw it up?
what do you mean? I can make any space.
No, not in between, like here.
No,
Oh,
because C# ignores all those
Spaces.
spaces.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
okay.
So it really, when it compiles, when it builds the executable, C# ignores all the spaces. You can have 1 or 25. It's same for C#. So you see, if you have variable in different scopes, so you can create this variable with the same name. So, but you cannot create with the same name. So it was rule number 1. Now, if you want, you can access the variables in a higher scope from variables in outer scope from inner scope. For instance, if I had, let's remove this one, right? Let's call the variable int outer, and this one int inner. And if you want to print both variables, we will use string interpolation, right? It's a outer and print outer variable, inner, and if you run this one, you see it prints 1 and inner 0. So the code inside the block sees the variable outside the block.
Oh, so but the inside variable does not see what's on the outside?
Inside variable sees outside. Now let's try to call the same function out of scope. Now if we try to build this, you see it doesn't see inner because it's inside the block.
Okay, so it's like a separate scope within a scope, but it's not like part of that scope.
So you cannot see from outside, but from inside you can see. So from inside I can see inner and outer, but from outside I can only see anything on this is my scope, right? Anything created in my scope I can see, or higher. So here in this scope, right, I can see anything inside my scope or above. So how does this works with functions? If you remember, we created functions as following: static void outer and outer. Now we can call it and it works.
I have a question. So here you made up here, so static void main string args. So here static void outer, is that a separate function?
It is a separate
But
function,
they
right?
still read each other and go along with each other, right?
That's a good question. Actually, you see, so since I'm calling this function, right, it's inside this scope, right? So I can see anything inside this scope and in the scope above. And since this outer function is inside this scope, right, I can see it.
So, but if they're in the same scope, you can see them, but if they're not in the same scope, you can't?
If, for instance, let's make another function. inside, right? Void outer inner, and I can call outer inner from here because it's inside my scope, right? Let's see if it builds. It builds successfully, but I cannot call outer inner from here because it's in a different scope. You see, it's I can see only my scope or above. It's not inside this scope and it's not in this scope, right? It's inside this scope. That's why you cannot see. So this is how, so this works exactly like variables, right? So you can see in your scope or above, but you cannot see in a scope below or in a different scope. But functions also have a different kind of exception. When you create a function, you cannot create a function with the same name unless you have different parameters. When you use parameters, it's the signature of the function changes. So if I have int p, right, and if I print outer and say p equal p, I cannot create function with the same name with the same parameters.
But you can create with different parameters in the same.
I can create with different parameter types.
Okay.
You see it? Now it builds. If it pass correct parameters.
Okay.
So now it builds, right? What it means, you cannot have same type but different variable name, because this doesn't have, it doesn't care. So if I call it para, right, it still believes that it's the same function, because they really look at the name of the function and parameters types, not the. But if I do string, because it's different parameter type, it builds. Now, how C# knows which function to use? Because I can call it now. Like
because,
this, right?
Yeah, because strings use double quotes and the integers don't.
So C# when it has parameters with the same name, it looks so functions with the same name. It looks the parameter types and sees, oh, one is type of int, so I'm gonna use this function. Or apple is parameter string. Let's say outer string, and let's run. So it knows that it needs to call this function based on the parameters. So pretty smart. So it's either called outer print one or outer string, depending on the parameter passed to the variable.
So I have another question. If I wanted to do, since strings can be integers as long as they have quotes, could I do something like for here as long as I have the quotations?
So yes, if you put the quotations, C# doesn't parse what's inside. It believes it's everything in the string, and it doesn't know if it's number or anything. So it will call which function, up or down.
We'll call the string.
It will call this. You see, it even shows which how the corresponding function. And last thing, about scope, there is interesting exception to all of this, or different behavior. It's a for loop. When you create a variable in for loop, right, you create like this inside this parenthesis. So if you run, so you create a variable. So how do you think where it will be available? What's its scope?
For loop is its scope, right?
Yes. Even if you don't have, so since even if technically int I is not like in the scope, so it looks like it's on the line and it looks like it belongs to this scope, it really belongs to this scope because you cannot use it after the loop. After the loop, it says does not exist. So immediately after this scope of the for loop finishes, the variable gets destroyed and you cannot have access to it.
So this is, you said this is an exception for a for loop, but a while loop is kind of like a for loop. So is it an exception for while?
In while loop you don't declare the variable, right? The only time you declare variable in this things, it's when you do for loop, right?
Okay.
You declare variable. It's one of the features of the for loop.
So that's it. Okay, that's it for today on Code with Camilla. Come back next week for more videos, and don't forget to subscribe.